Thanks so much for attending. Welcome, welcome. We're going to get started in just a moment. Again, welcome again. My name is Dr. Aaron Gregory. I'm an assistant professor with Native American Studies at Cal Poly Humboldt, program coordinator of Masters of Engineering and Community Practice, member of the Ethnic Studies Council, editor for 4S Back Channels, scholar of science and technology studies situated in Native Indigenous context of energy and infrastructure, also a proud member of the BIPOC community. Thank you all so much for attending the first session of our fall 2023 Decolonizing Sustainability Speaker Series. Yeah. It's really wonderful to have you all back in person and to continue to develop and engage in an active community. It's really wonderful to see you all here. Quick introduction to the Decolonizing Speaker Series. This speaker series aims to problematize the discourse and direction of sustainability, often used to frame contemporary issues of climate change and environmental degradation. The term and concept of sustainability is rooted and often integral to the ongoing systems and logics of settler colonialism, the political economy of global capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and the corresponding instantiations of racial, spatial, gendered, sexual, class-based, and anthropocentric oppression. Indeed, sustainability is often deployed to sustain structural inequities, techniques of governmental control, and subordination of disciplined and marginalized subjectivities under the guise of environmentalism and climate change. The Decolonizing Sustainability Speaker Series is intended to provide a window and critical angle of approach to the problematic logics, discourses, and systems of sustainability as inextricably entangled with colonialism and capitalism. This speaker series and its contributors are committed to decolonizing sustainability by amplifying Indigenous and BIPOC voices, experiences, and knowledges. If you're new to our speaker series, I encourage you to check out our previous sessions posted on the Cal Poly Humboldt Native American YouTube channel. All right, a quick note on where we are today and perhaps why we're here. We're gathered here today in a very important space on campus. We're in the Native American Forum. The official name of the space is the Native American Forum and has been since the opening of the Behavioral and Social Sciences building in 2007. The design of the Native Forum is modeled after a traditional house, traditional to Native and Northern California tribes. In January of 2015, Cal Poly Humboldt students occupied the Native Forum to call attention to how the university celebrates and supports diversity, including its Native, Indigenous, and BIPOC students' voices and community. Students had specific concerns with many issues, but one of them was the designation, signage, and support for the Native Forum and Native programs on campus. Students expressed frustration that while the BSS building had originally included an entire first floor dedicated to Native programs, over the years, these spaces had lost any connection to Native peoples and communities. Because of the student activism, the Native Forum was rededicated and officially named as the Native Forum. In October 2019, NAS was officially able to secure funding and remodel the lobby outside of the Native Forum, something that was appreciated by tribal peoples and communities and students because it brought a clear Native and Indigenous presence to the space and campus. And last year, the area surrounding the Behavioral and Social Sciences building became officially named Wiyot Plaza, a name gifted by the Wiyot tribe. The space encompasses many of our indigenized spaces on campus, including the Native American Forum, the Houdini Gallery, the Raul de la Guerra Food Sovereignty Lab, and Traditional Ecological Knowledges Institutes. Wiyot Plaza is a space under the care of the FSL as our exterior space allocation, which is in the process of becoming an experimental learning space and outdoor classroom. This space includes the salmon cooking pit behind the Native American Forum, the Indigenous garden, and the native plant landscape. The primary goal is the return of tribal community access and sovereignty to the landscape, while also creating a space that centers land-based and place-based learning pedagogies on campus. Welcome to Wiyot Plaza. Our university, Cal Poly Humboldt, occupies the unceded lands of the Wiyot peoples, which include the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Gudini, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods, was renamed Arcata by settlers in 1860. Despite this, Wiyot peoples maintain connections to their territory through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. Wiyot peoples are central to the history and future of this place. If you haven't already, I recommend that you watch Dr. Kutcher Riesling Baldy's lecture on land acknowledgements titled, "What Good is a Land Acknowledgement?" This is available on Cal Poly Humboldt Native American Studies website as well. A few additional items in terms of translating land acknowledgements to action. Please feel free to go to the Wiyot Tribe on Facebook. You can follow the Native American Studies Department also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Certainly feel free to pay the Wiyot Honor Tax, another way of translating land acknowledgements to action. You can donate to our Food Sovereignty Lab through giving.humboldt. Also, we're currently fundraising for a construction bill to finalize our Food Sovereignty Lab, which you see in the midst of construction. So as much as we can garner community support, that would be greatly appreciated. A few final housekeeping notes. Hopefully you've got some snacks and beverages available in the lobby. Also, we should note that the Food Sovereignty Lab, as well as the bookstore, are tabling in the lobby. And I encourage you all to stop by, check out the work being done by the lab, and of course, support our local bookstores. Lastly, students of NAS 104 with my course, as well as Dr. Reed's, hopefully you've signed in or will email us. We're happy to provide extra credit. We're always happy and encouraging of student engagement and support, as well as that of our faculty, staff, and community. There will be a Q&A session after Dr. Reed's talk. But before that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kaitlin Reed and the work that they'll be discussing today. Dr. Kaitlin Reed is a member of Yurok, Hoopa, and Oneida Peoples and assistant professor of Native American Studies at Cal Poly Humboldt. Research is focused on tribal land rights and water rights, extractive capitalism, and settler colonial political economies. Dr. Reed is currently working, indeed finishing her book entitled Cannabis, From Gold Rush to Green Rush, The Ecology of Settler Colonialism in Northern California. The book connects the historical and ecological dots between the gold rush and the green rush, focusing on the capitalistic resource extraction and violence against indigenous lands and bodies. Dr. Reed gained her BA in geography from Vassar College and MA and PhD in Native American Studies at the University of California. Dr. Reed is an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe in Northwestern California, and in her free time.
I forgot that was
Yeah. Maybe some video games, maybe some reality television if you know Dr. Reed. Some quality time with her partner, including a lovely fuzzy cat. Yes. Dr. Reed's new book, Settler Cannabis, provides an indispensable and critical window to the green rush as an extension and intensification of settler colonial resource extraction and wealth accumulation. Situating the cannabis industry within this broader legacy of rush mentality, Dr. Reed traces the patterns of resource rushing, first gold, then timber, then fish, and now cannabis, to reveal the ongoing impacts upon indigenous cultures, lands, waters, and bodies. Dr. Reed, in this new and exciting book, shares this history to inform the path for an alternative future, one that starts with the return of the land to indigenous stewardship and sovereignty, while rejecting the commodification and control of so-called nature for profit. Combining archival research and testimonies and interviews with tribal members, tribal employees, and settler state employees, Settler Cannabis offers a groundbreaking analysis of the environmental consequences of cannabis cultivation that foregrounds indigenous voices, experiences, histories, and knowledges. Without further ado, Dr. Kaitlin Reed.
Thank you, Dr. Gregory, for that very kind introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome, great. Thank you all so much for being here. Academics often worry that they'll show up and do a talk by themselves. So it's always very, very heartwarming when there are people in the room. So thank you all, and happy Indigenous Peoples Week, everybody. I hope you're enjoying. One thing I like to brag about Cal Poly Humboldt is a couple years ago, we got written up in a conservative watchdog post that we are one of the worst offenders in the nation about celebrating Columbus Day. We celebrate Columbus Day the worst. So I think that's a badge that we can wear. So I'm going to talk about my new book. In my head, it was called From Gold Rush to Green Rush. The press was like, great, but no thanks. We're going to call it Settler Cannabis. From Gold Rush to Green Rush in Indigenous Northern California. They wanted cannabis in the title so that when you Google it, it comes up. I don't have a marketing degree, so I let it go. In the first half of the book, I'm really trying to kind of connect some of the ecological dots from the gold rush into the green rush. And if you read the book, you might think, wow, it's really taking her a long time to get to cannabis. The same will be true of my talk this evening, because we have a lot to cover before we get into the cultivation of cannabis in Northwestern California. And so I start with an important term that I want to talk about in the talk tonight, and it's in the kind of riffed on in the title of Settler Cannabis. I want to spend a few minutes kind of talking about this term settler colonialism that we use in Native American studies and critical Indigenous studies, as it provides me a really important kind of theoretical framework for really understanding connections between resource rushing in California, but also kind of on the flip side of that, right? As we mentioned, one of our goals of this speaker series is really unpacking the way that settler colonial ideology is really embedded in a lot of the environmental discourse that we use on a regular basis, kind of relying on this idea that these places are wildernesses, right? Devoid, right, of human connection and people. And we often kind of neglect the ways in which the forced removal and violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples was a really big part of American environmentalism and with the kind of reluctance to really critically analyze, right, those origins often leads to a lot of really critical tensions between contemporary environmental movements and Indigenous communities. And so I'm going to put my professor hat on for a moment and we'll go through a quick vocab lesson. Settler colonialism, as opposed to other forms of colonialism that we might learn about in our K through 12 experience, right? TR and his big stick, the Berlin Conference, these sorts of things. Settler colonism instead is really focused on the acquisition of lands, right? Traditional forms of exploitation, colonialism, you go there, you steal a bunch of stuff, you make money, you come home. Settler colonialism has like an added complication, because now you want to turn this place into your home, but there's millions of people living there. So what do you do about that, right? And so settler colonism, right, then has to project ideas like manifest destiny, right? Who learned about manifest destiny in elementary school? All right, God-given right to land, right? We have to tell ourselves and invent stories that justify, right, the violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples' territories. And then those stories are kind of perpetuated right throughout our K through 12 experience, right? Instead of depicting all of Turtle Island as a complex ecosystem with intimate relations with Indigenous peoples and a product of adept stewardship kind of cultivated over millennia, instead the US depicts, right, an entire land of free real estate, right? And so this is a really important conceptual shift that we really need to highlight, because land goes from something that is living, a family member, an ancestor, a kin, right, to an object, to something that's dead, right? Private property, real estate, right? And peoples who have a relationship with land outside of the framework of private property or real estate get demarcated as primitive, right? Pagan, uncivilized. And these types of relationships to land are dehumanized and attacked. And so within a framework of settler colonialism, its most important concerns are land, water, and resources. scholars Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang, right, in their article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, that this is for two reasons, right? First, settlers need to create a new home. They justify this through stories like Manifest Destiny, right, as well as a source of capital, right, to begin the process of resource exploitation for the primary goal of monetary gain. And then simultaneously, that disruption of indigenous relationships to land represents profound violence. Again, this violence is not temporary and like relegated to 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? But it is violence that is continually enacted on the landscape every day, right? A couple other things I want to say about settler colonialism. Its goal is to eliminate Native peoples in order to gain access to land. This elimination takes place in a lot of different ways. Often we think about kind of the sensationalized violence of the gold rush, right? We know about the militias that are formed and then compensated to hunt Native people from the 1850s into the 1870s. We don't tend to think about kind of other forms of violence, right, as a form of elimination, right? And so we could think about the cultural elimination of indigenous peoples through institutions like boarding schools, right? For example, we can think about forms of elimination as forced sterilization, which the Indian Health Service was doing as late as the late 1970s to Native American women throughout the US without their consent. We can think about political elimination, right, through termination, not affirming treaty rights, right? And then, of course, discursive elimination by not learning anything accurate about indigenous peoples at all in public school. Right? I have to spend the first month of a college level course kind of undoing all the damage and harm that public curricula does in regards to Native people. And then the second argument I'd like to highlight here, and I think is quite significant in understanding resource rushing in California, is Wolf's argument that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. And when this argument, what we're talking about here is that settler colonialism isn't something that happened in 1849 and is now complete and it's now over. Right, but it's something that's ongoing every day. It is a structure that frames the way we live in the society. It frames the way we think about natural resources and land management, right? How we think of relatives, right, as commodities or economic resources, right? And the violence of settler colonialism as well is ongoing. Another scholar I really rely on throughout the book is a sociologist named J.M. Bacon, and he uses this concept called colonial ecological violence, right? And what he's thinking about is the way that settler colonial violence is enacted through the landscape, right? And the violence enacted against the landscape is then paralleled or felt in the bodies of indigenous peoples, right? So one example, between 1850 and 1860, the state of California dumps 13 tons of mercury into our river systems, right? And so we can think about contemporary mercury contamination, which is disproportionate in indigenous subsistence fishing communities, right? As like a contemporary manifestation of settler colonial violence, right? And so that's kind of the line of thinking I'm going down. And so some of the examples of settler colonial elimination that Bacon talks about is the theft of water, right? The contamination of water or traditional food sources, right? The disruption of traditional ecological knowledge, the criminalization of traditional ecological knowledge, right? Through fire suppression policies in California, for example, right? We can think about it through land loss, right? If you can't access your ancestral territories, right? Via a form of elimination, and then discursive elimination by renaming all the places, right? And then making a new map and saying, look what we founded, right? Or repurposing, right, culturally significant places as well. I also want to think about settler colonialism and really kind of highlight this as an ecological phenomenon. I find it very fascinating how much of environmental history in the US ignores settler colonialism. And for me, it's like this massive elephant in the room, right? Raise your hand if you've ever grown a garden. All right. Now imagine somebody forced you at gunpoint 100 miles west of your garden, and they incarcerated you and you couldn't get to your garden for a year or 10 years or maybe 100 years. What does your garden look like? It's not a garden anymore, right? And so if we operate under the assumption that indigenous peoples aren't these primitive hunter-gatherers wandering around in loincloths, grabbing a berry here and a berry there, but we're scientists with complex systems of ecological knowledge developed over millennia, right? The removal and murder of indigenous peoples is obviously going to have ecological ramifications, right? Here in California, we can see that in our forests, right? Many of our forests are really sick and haven't had access to fire medicine in a really long time, right? Due to suppression policies enacted by the state of California. And so when we remove the knowledge and impact that Native peoples had on kind of facilitating biodiversity within their ancestral territories, we're missing actually like an enormous piece of the environmental history of that place, right? And so if we want to, right, improve our environmental systems, right, and kind of bring the world back into balance, we have to have a good understanding of what has happened in that place and the environmental history of that place. One thing I hear from environmental movements a lot is that we have to turn back the ecological clock. Have people heard this? It really grinds my gears because I'm like, turn it back to what? When it was an empty, untouched wilderness? Because that hasn't existed. Right? Native peoples have been stewarding our ecosystems for a very, very long time. And so this idea of the new world, right, is really, really old. And we often work to erase, right, legacies of indigenous knowledge and presence in our landscapes. And so whenever I do a talk, I always imagine people are in the audience like, is she going to talk about cannabis like she promised? I start here. Right? Because before we can even get into the ecological impacts of cannabis cultivation, we need to understand the deep and intimate connections indigenous peoples have with their territory, right? And their very complex and highly developed knowledge systems about how to live in that place and take care of that place, right? And now we can talk about cannabis. I start by saying cannabis is a plant, and that means it's alive. That means it's a relative, and we have to treat it with care and respect. And all of the problems I will highlight in my talk today aren't because of this relative, right? They're because of the structures of settler colonialism that transform relatives and kinship networks into commodities, into natural resources, into real estate, right? Cannabis had been on the North American continent since invasion. Fun fact, it actually used to be illegal not to grow cannabis in the United States. In Jamestown, 1607, there was a directive that everybody in the town needed to be growing cannabis because hemp was one of the most valuable fibers around. Columbus's 3 ships made out of hemp, right? So there's like a long kind of legacy of this relative's presence in Turtle Island. And the other thing I say about the plant is, to me, cannabis is almonds. Okay? Sometimes when we start talking about cannabis and the environmental impacts of cannabis, we start going down unuseful roads. It's a Schedule 1 substance. People shouldn't grow it because it's a drug and it is bad and blah, right? To me, that really detracts from the actual conversations I want to have, right? How much water is being funneled out of my river system? How many fish are dying, right? How many Humboldt fishers are exposed to rodenticides? Like, those are the questions I want to talk about. And I often think kind of the morality issue kind of clouds what I think are the important issues. So almonds. A lot of people drink almond milk, yeah? Whether we have a lactose intolerance, whether we want to consume less dairy products, for whatever reason, many of us might drink almond milk. Almonds are also grown in massive quantities in Central California and use a huge amount of water. Most of them are exported across the globe, primarily Eastern Asia, and a small select few corporations make a ton of money off that. But when we start to talk about the ecological impacts of almonds, nobody's like, well, you shouldn't even be eating almonds, right? Like, that's not a useful conversation, right? So for me, I try to really kind of take the moral concern of the crop in question out of the conversation. And to me, this is just one other example of a crop that is over-concentrated in biologically sensitive ecosystems, right? And that is the matter at hand. I want to say a few words about prohibition and the use of drug surveillance, right, as a means to control populations. What I say about drug prohibition is it's never been about what marijuana or cannabis does. It's about who uses it, right? The state of California is the first state to outlaw cannabis in the United States. They did the same exact thing with opium a century prior as a means to harass and prosecute Chinese migrants during the exclusion era. And then, right, did the same thing a century later to kind of prosecute and harass primarily indigenous peoples coming from what is now Mexico, Central America, and South America, right? And so when we talk about drug prohibition, it's just a big white supremacist, racist project, and I'll leave it there. All right, welcome to California. California is hands down one of the largest cannabis producing regions in the entire country, perhaps the globe. Looking back, I first got started this line of research when I was a freshman, first week of college. I was in my dorm room and we were kind of going around the circle, right, sharing information. And I'm like, I'm a Yurok tribal member. I was born in Humboldt County, you know, my little spiel. And everybody's eyes lit up. They were like, Humboldt County, right? And I was in upstate New York at the time, right? And so as like a prospective geography major, I'm like, how did this product make it from my ancestral territory over 3,000 miles away to a college dorm room on the eastern seaboard where it was being sold for literally $65 for an eighth, right? Incredibly expensive, right, for these young college kids, right? And so I started kind of being interested in that, right? What's happening to my tribal territory at home, right? Who's making money off of this product, and why am I finding it in a dorm room in New York, right? And so we are kind of home to a large cannabis producing region. I have some old statistics I'll share, and it's kind of hard to get kind of super contemporary data, given that so much cannabis cultivation in the state remains outside of the regulated market. But in 2006, it was estimated that our two highest legal exports, corn and wheat, were at about $30 billion. The informal estimate for cannabis was at 35 billion, right? So that's more than our two highest exports combined. So we're not talking like little tiny mom and pop shops, right? We're talking about pretty wide scale cultivation. And when I started kind of becoming interested in cannabis kind of academically, right, as a site of research, I began to be kind of inundated with this imagery of the green rush. Who's heard of the green rush before or seen kind of references or images like this, right? And I was just kind of seeing this everywhere. And I was starting graduate school at the time and reading a ton of books about California Indian history and spending a lot of time learning about the impacts of the gold rush on indigenous peoples, the timber rush on indigenous peoples, the fish rush on indigenous peoples. And it felt like to me, there was this incredible absence of indigenous voices and perspectives on this matter, right? And I thought to myself, we didn't have a seat at the table during the gold rush, right? Militias were hunting native peoples. If you were in a public area, you were charged with loitering and you were auctioned off into slavery if you were a California Indian person during the mid 1800s. And so my thinking was well, we're going to give ourselves a seat at this table, right? And so my goal in this work was to really center indigenous perspectives on history, right? But also kind of the contemporary ecological impacts of cannabis cultivation that I felt weren't really being given kind of much of the spotlight. So I want to talk a little bit about the gold rush for folks who may be unfamiliar. In California, we really celebrate and memorialize the gold rush. Right? Raise your hand if you dressed up like a miner in elementary school. Raise your hand if you went on a field trip and had to pan for gold. Right? We reenact this. We play it out. We celebrate it. We memorialize it every year. We have festivals. Right? If you take out your driver's license right now, there's a gold miner sitting next to your head, right? And so every time I get ID'd, right, I have to look at a picture of a gold miner, right? As if that is central to the story of this place my people have lived for 15,000 years, right? And so for me, the celebration and memorialization of the gold rush really invisibilizes California Indian experience. For California Indians, the gold rush was an apocalypse. Right, legally defined genocide is what happened here. Right, here's some data for folks to look at. So what the state did is it formed volunteer militias and then funded those militias to go hunt Native peoples. And so what we are looking at here is how much money the state is paying out for expeditions to kill Indians in various regions of California. In Trinity, Klamath, and Clear Lake between 1850 and 1852, the state of California paid over $34K to kill Native peoples. In the first 2 years that they do this, it's over $1 million a year that they're paying out for killing Native peoples. By 1857, it's only $400K. Why the sharp decline? Any guesses? Sorry, what? Yeah. Oh. Well, there's less Indians, right? They're doing their job quite well, right? Here in this region, we know that over 56 massacres took place between 1850 and 1864. Many of us know about what happened on Tuluwat. This was happening throughout the region, right? Here are some headlines from a newspaper. This one was near Sutter Road in McKinleyville. And here are some discharge papers for the Indian Wars against the Indians in the Humboldt and Klamath regions that documents the violence that occurred in this region. Simultaneously, while genocide was occurring in California, we see a massive dispossession of indigenous territory. And so between 1850 and 1852, there are over 18 treaties that get negotiated in California. This would have reserved almost 8% of the state. And so all of the lands that are highlighted in dark gray here on this map would have been reserved through these treaties. The treaty negotiators show up in Washington, D.C., and they're like, hey, Congress, we just negotiated 18 treaties. And they're like, in California, where there's gold, why would you ever give Indian peoples like land in California? That's our paradise, right? Leave it alone. So they lock those 18 treaties in a lockbox. They put what is called a secrecy injunction on them. They literally wrap the box in red tape, and they're not open until 1905. Meanwhile, you have all of these tribal leaders in California that are like, well, we negotiated this treaty, we're cool, right? Creating what we then call landless tribes in California. And that's why we have so many tribes in California that do not have reservations or rancherias, is because the treaties in California were never ratified. Additionally, when we talk about the negotiation of these treaties, we have to keep in mind that there was an active genocide happening. That influences how you are going to come into that negotiation. And treaty signers on the US side are bringing the army with them. So that's probably relevant, right? And so for me in my book, I really kind of connect the genocide against California Indian peoples with the dispossession of lands. And then, of course, we need to think about the ecological impacts, because when we talk about the ecological impacts of cannabis, which we will get to, I promise, those aren't like the very first ecological impacts that are happening, right? It's not in a historical vacuum, but these are compounded impacts, right? They're building off an already damaged ecosystem. So forests are clear cut. We see waterways polluted with mercury. Entire rivers are diverted. Livestock then change the species composition of grasslands and woodlands. Hooves do a number on like tubers and roots that we would often use. The prohibition of burning, right? Unfun fact, the state of California sneaks in a fire suppression clause into one of the pieces of legislation to facilitate the slavery of indigenous peoples. It's like a pretty long law, and section 10 is like one sentence, and they just sneak in a fire suppression clause. It's the Act for the Governance and Protection of Indians. Oh no, my slides just went, sorry. Let me go back. All right, we're right here. Apologies. Okay. I ruined it. Food sources, right, are under threat. And then what I want to really emphasize here is that what begins with the gold rush, right, this creation story of California and resource rushing, it doesn't end there, right? I always ask people, did everybody get rich on gold? No, of course not, because the real gold was land, right? And then from the gold rush, we move into the timber rush, the fish rush, the green rush, and there is a parallel of violence against indigenous lands and bodies. And one way I want to kind of illustrate this argument that I'm making is that there's a parallel between violence enacted against landscape and violence enacted against indigenous bodies. We'll look at that through traditional foods. So I want to talk about salmon for a quick moment and really highlight this important text. Sorry, my Zoom bar is covering the author. It's Dr. Kari Marie Norgaard. She worked with Karuk ceremonial leader and cultural practitioner Ron Reed to write this book, Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People. And she offers this statistic in her book that I find fascinating. In 1850, Karuk families on average were eating about 400 pounds of salmon a year, right? Like, that's over a pound a day. That's salmon in all 3 meals, right? It's part of your core diet. In 2010, they did another study. And on average, Karuk families ate less than 5 pounds of salmon a year, right? They estimate that that's one of the largest dietary transformations to occur in North America, right? And so I pulled these 2 graphs from her book to illustrate what contemporary settler colonial violence might look like, right? And so in the top graph, we see when diabetes first appeared in folks' families. The longest bar is the 1970s, right? The second longest bar, 1980s, then 1990s, and then fourth place is the 1960s. This graph shows us the dark line is the percentage of families with diabetes, right? This line is increasing over time, right? And the gray line shows us the percentage of families that are able to harvest spring Chinook salmon as a significant food source, right? And this gray line is going down. It intersects right here in the mid-1960s. Does anybody know what happened in the mid-1960s that might be relevant in terms of salmon consumption? Dams, right? The Klamath River is dammed. Salmon are unable, right, to get upriver into Karuk ancestral territory, right? And so because of settler colonial imposition of ecological management regimes, right? Let's dam the river so we can have the things we want, right? So we can generate profit, hydroelectricity, these sorts of things, right? On the flip side then, Karuk families are prevented, right, from accessing a very culturally important and nutritious, right, traditional food. And now we see extremely high rates of diabetes. And so when I talk about health impacts, and you already saw the meme, right, I have to link all of contemporary health problems in Indigenous communities, right, back to settler colonialism, right, and the ways in which settler colonial ecological management regimes, right, are imposed on Indigenous lands and territories. I want to talk about chapter 4 a little bit from the book. I borrow this chapter title from an alum of Cal Poly Humboldt from the Environment and Community Program, Laura Hurwitz. She wrote her master's thesis on the Black Bear Commune in ancestral Karuk territory because that is what brought her to Northern California originally. Then she went to grad school and learned about settler colonialism, went back, she's like, hey guys, I have some bad news. And so her thesis is called Back to Whose Land? And I think that question so eloquently and succinctly really illustrates the critique I want to put forth of the Back to the Land movement. Right here in Humboldt, we tend to really romanticize the Back to the Land movement and view it with a heavy dose of nostalgia. In the book, I argue it's another example of white flight, even though we often don't use that type of language to talk about that. We see primarily middle class to lower upper class white folks from places like UC Davis and UC Berkeley, these sorts of places coming up into Northern California. The reason they were able to afford land is because of the collapse of the timber industry. And they're like, great, well, we'll buy some land and then we'll live off the land. They quickly realized they had no idea how to do that and needed some sort of cash income, right, to supplement their living off of the land. And so we begin to see the cultivation of cannabis first in kind of small quantities in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. There's not a ton written about cannabis cultivation in Humboldt. We have a couple key texts. One of them is this book. I'd say this one probably has like the most kind of gets talked about the most within these conversations. It's called Cash Crop, An American Dream by Ray Raphael. And if that doesn't illustrate, right, this idea of resource rationing, I was like, dang it, he took my title. No, but something he says in this book that I find really fascinating is that he's very critical, right, of what he calls these newcomers, these cannabis cultivators that are now flocking into Humboldt County to make a ton of money off cannabis, and juxtaposes them to this first wave of cannabis cultivators, right? Kind of folks coming after the collapse of the timber industry, coming, right, not to like make a ton of money off cannabis cultivation, but kind of just to make ends meet. And he kind of draws a really stark divide, right, between these two groups of growers. He calls the latter, right, the newcomers, the green rushers. And how he refers to these folks, he calls them indigenous people. And so the erasure, right, of Wiyot, Yurok, Hoopa, Tolowa, and Karuk people is really pervasive in this text, right? Because his kind of goal in this book is to really be like, hey, it's not our fault, right? There's all of these newcomers, right, coming in and using very destructive practices to cultivate cannabis. And in so doing and creating that juxtaposition, right, he depicts back to the landers as indigenous to this place, as kind of rightful owners and stewards of this place. And so for me, that was a really alarming erasure of indigenous peoples, and one that I think is kind of pervades throughout, right, this kind of discourse of the back to the land movement and even cannabis discourse. And one thing I really began to notice in my early research, because a lot of folks were like, tell me really fun stories, right, about the back to the land movement, the good old days, which, like, where have we heard that before, right? And to me, I kind of started to really notice and pay attention to kind of this ideological connection between cannabis cultivation and like this environmental ethos, right? Like, oh, cannabis cultivators like are tree huggers, right? So this can't be bad for the environment, right? Like, we love the land, we're one with the earth, right? How could this be problematic or harmful? And I found that type of rhetoric really kind of did a disservice, right, to a lot of the work local tribal nations were doing to kind of draw out some of these ecological impacts of cannabis, which often aren't really taken seriously by the industry and lobbies of the legal industry. I love this quote by Dr. Cutcher Risling Baldy, and I like to share it whenever I do talks. And again, I think it really kind of gets at what I'm trying to illustrate here, right? This resource rushing is a pattern. It's not over, right? Just like settler colonialism, right? It's a structure, not an event, right? It just happens to look different, right? Every couple decades or every couple centuries, right? Cutcher writes or said, the rush mentality is what founded Humboldt County. People act like that was so long ago, and we've definitely moved on. That we're this really green, friendly place. We're liberal, we're leftist. This is how people think of Humboldt County. But what founded us is this gold rush, and we've been rushing ever since. So after the gold rush, well, gold didn't make us enough money. Let's rush any kind of minerals we can get. And then after that, well, that didn't make us enough. Let's rush timber. And I think we've been rushing since 1849. Right. So kind of recap of where we've gone so far. Part one of the book really tries to, well, the press got rid of part one and part two, but I'm going to pretend they still exist. Part one demonstrates the ecological mechanics of settler colonial domination via the gold rush, timber rush, fish rush, and green rush. Some of the things I try to highlight here, right? The connection between genocide and ecocide, right? The imposition of land as property as a form of dispossession, the imposition of Western land management regimes, the criminalization of indigenous ecological knowledge and practices. And then part two tries to really document the specific harms from the green rush that we see on indigenous communities situated within settler colonial orientations to land and resources. So some of the things I'll mention here, right? Ongoing settler colonial land dispossession and removal, formation and creation of water rights, toxicity as a settler colonial violence, and then violence enacted against bodies via trafficking, incarceration, and labor exploitation. So let's start with water. This is a photograph that was taken during Operation Yurok, an example of a makeshift water storage system at a trespass cultivation site. So basically what they did is they dug a big hole, they lined a tarp in it, and the other side of this pipe is in a tributary or the main stem of the river, wherever it happens to be. It's being pumped right into this makeshift pond. There have been cases, right, where as a result of this, they've completely like dewatered, right, an entire tributary. Couple clarifying things. All the photographs that we're going to look at are from trespass cultivation sites. These are grow sites that have no interest in kind of pursuing a kind of legal compliance strategy, right? They're often showing up in tribal territories, on reservation lands, just outside of the reservation boundary, federal lands, state land, right? They're kind of putting together their grow site. After harvest, they'll be out of there. Right. And so the kind of very transitory grow sites that aren't like invested, right, in ecological protections or kind of long-term infrastructure. All of the photographs that we're going to see were taken between 2014 and 2017, roughly. And all of these photographs were taken within Yurok ancestral territory. So just as kind of a little bit of context for the photographs that we're going to look at. A couple other things I'll note about this photograph specifically. A lot of people that grow up or show up in the hills ready to grow weed, like don't have a PhD in agronomy, right? Probably haven't spent much time looking at like agricultural best practices and know very, very little, kind of just about the basics. And so at some of the abandoned grow sites that we have documented, there have been situations where people will buy like a 40-gallon drum like of a particular chemical, and then they have to dilute it, right? And so like it'll be like 10% solution, like 90% water, and they have no idea. So they'll just like dump that drum into like a makeshift pond like this, right? Because they aren't agronomists. They're not agriculturalists, and they're often engaging with these types of products for the first time. And then that water will be delivered kind of down the hillside and then ultimately feed back into the tributaries or main stem of the river. This is another example of the type of water storage we would find at a trespass grow site. And I got to observe Operation Yurok in 2016. They made me sign a form that says if I got shot, I wouldn't sue anybody. But didn't give me like a bulletproof vest or anything. And so we're on this tour and I'm like this like dorky researcher, like taking a bunch of notes and pictures. And one of the guys in the crew used to be a plumber and he kept telling me that. And I'm like, all right, cool, whatever. And he's like, no. And he's like, none of them know how to do plumbing. And I'm like, again, great. But then I figured out what he was trying to tell me. What that means is not only are they kind of sucking water up out of the tributaries or the main stem for water storage to later use for cannabis irrigation, but this is leaking 24/7. Right. And so there's that kind of also the added like waste of water that we kind of have to add on top of calculations for water use, which is incredibly difficult to do when it's unregulated water diversions. Right. It's very, very challenging to get accurate estimates of how much water is actually being used. These are polyethylene tubes that you will see at many trespass grow sites, and they run all up and down the mountainsides and deliver water stored in systems like this or this to the plants themselves. In the prologue of the book, if you check it out, $29.99 in the lobby. When I was first doing my field work and kind of encountering these tubes, it was back in 2016, and folks may know what was happening in Oceti-Sakowin territory at that time. Water protectors were rising up against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And one of my amazing colleagues in graduate school, Dr. Jessere Growing Thunder, who is Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota, told us the story of the Black Snake prophecy, or Zuzeka Sapa. And I'm not nearly as good of a storyteller as she is, so my apologies. But the Oceti-Sakowin have this story that one day a black snake would enter their territory, and it would cross their territory and it would destroy everything in its path. And it would be up to the people to rise up and defeat that black snake, right? Pretty obviously, right? The Dakota Access Pipeline. But when Jessere told me that story, I thought about these guys, right? We don't have one giant, big black snake that we can see from miles and miles off in our territory. We have thousands hundreds of thousands, perhaps, right? Tiny, tiny black snakes that can be hard to see. They are difficult to remove, right? I spent several very, very hot summer afternoons ripping up these pipe tubes, and I'd create like massive piles, and I'd be like drenched in sweat, and I'd turn around and be like, oh my God, there's so much more. And it's very, very labor intensive and time consuming to remove all the infrastructure that is put into the landscape to facilitate cannabis cultivation in this region. I want to show some examples of kind of aerial shots of the clear cutting involved. Obviously, Yurok ancestral territory is incredibly forested and very mountainous. Right, so this means we're talking really steep slopes, right? So we see a lot of soil erosion happening, right, as a result of this clear cutting. And then, of course, right, habitat loss is a key issue here. And what a lot of wildlife ecologists say is that, so kind of one of the strategies of cultivation kind of left over from like the war on drugs days is like, rather than having like one massive grow, right, you have several smaller grows kind of spaced out, right? That's why if like the DEA hits up one, right, you still have a couple eggs left in your basket, right? And so what that ultimately does is it actually increases the amount of habitat fragmentation that occurs because you're increasing that kind of buffer zone, like around the clear-cutted area in the forested ecosystem. And so it actually kind of magnifies some of the impacts, right? Rather than if there was just like one big clear cut, we see more impacts on habitat loss when we have like kind of several smaller clustered clear cuts close together. But simultaneously, often grow sites will create a network of trail systems to connect from grow to grow, right? And what wildlife ecologists have found is that large predators will use that trail system because it's there. And so whereas before, right, that critter probably wouldn't have wandered into a trespass grow site, but now we've put this trail here, right? And they're just like following the trail, right? And so then you get black bears or mountain lions kind of just wandering in, right, into a grow site. And so we see a lot of harm happening to our more than human relatives just because they kind of happen to walk into those grow sites. Here's a comparison shot. Again, this is Yurok ancestral territory. And so this aerial photograph was taken before 2012. Same exact area after 2014, right? Operation Yurok begins in 2014. There was kind of a smaller cannabis eradication campaign that happened a year prior, but kind of the big Operation Yurok kind of formally emerges in 2014, right? And so we can kind of see this very large difference, right, in just 2 short years, right, of cultivation. I want to put a trigger warning out. I have a deceased more than human relative coming up on my next slide. So this is rodenticides, decon, right? This is an over-the-counter rat poison, often found at trespass cultivation sites. It is incredibly widespread. They now come in like bacon flavor, right? And we only know that rodenticides are such a huge problem by accident. There was a wildlife biologist, Murad Gabriel, who was doing work near Hoopa, as well as the Sierra Nevadas. And they were they kept finding Humboldt martins and fishers that were dying around in these really, really remote places. And they were being, when they kind of did the lab surveys, right, they saw that there was like a big like vitamin K deficiency and they were like bleeding out essentially. And they would have never like thought to, and so this is like a household kind of product, right? Not something you would see like way out in the middle of the woods. And this team was like able to put it together that all of this rat poison, right, was being traced back to trespass cannabis cultivation. And had they like not figured that out, we wouldn't know that rat poisoning was such like a huge problem at these trespass cultivation sites. And so these get like sprinkled on the water line so that critters like won't chew through your irrigation tubes, and it'll get sprinkled right around a patch so that critters don't like go in and like ruin your plant or like ruin your crop. And so what happens when critters eat rodenticides is that their blood won't clot. So they affect it, like they start to bleed out, right, internally. They don't die immediately. They become a lot more vulnerable to predation. They get really woozy and slow, and they're like super easy prey. And so often what happens to critters that get poisoned with rodenticides is that they then get eaten by another critter, right? And so we're seeing that process of bioaccumulation, right, happening out in these remote hills. This is a hot dog that was found at a grow site, and it's stuffed with carbamates. I don't, caveat, I'm not like a pesticide scientist, but carbamates are not good for you and you should not consume them. And then here's another kind of example of the type of stuff we would find left over. Dr. Murad Gabriel shared with me that when he was doing work in the Sierra Nevadas, his whole crew had to wear hazmat suits. And they were at this grow site and they opened something up. And he said, like, had they not been wearing hazmat suits and if anybody had like gotten that stuff in their respiratory system, it could have been like extremely harmful or potentially fatal, right? And so we're talking about really, really like toxic substances. And then I'll also share another kind of really big issue is determining like what is abandoned at that site. Right. And so it's not like a filing shelf with all of the original containers and the instructions and kind of percentages of the compounds. Right. Often we're talking about like empty like milk jugs and like Nestle water bottles that are filled with something bright blue or bright pink. Right. And we're like, what is this? Right. So even figuring out what contaminants are left behind at the site is a really huge challenge, like let alone the process of then cleaning that up. And there's like a lot of it. One site I remember specifically, there was a greenhouse and the whole floor of the greenhouse was covered to about my knees with like empty bottles of chemicals, some like half full, some a quarter full. And to like walk through that greenhouse, we had to walk like this. Right. And like and then like it's somebody's job to go through and document like every single bottle, right? And like figure out what gets left behind at those sites, right? So it's a lot. Anybody seen Hoarders? Yeah, me too. I love it. I'm amazed at how much stuff they get in these really, really remote sites. Garbage and garbage for miles. When I was doing my research interviews, one guy shared a story with me that he was doing an ecological assessment at a grow site and the ground felt really spongy to him. And he's like, what is going on? And he realized he was standing on a mountain of garbage. They had dug out like a bunch of dirt out of an adjacent hill with a tractor and just like put it on this like giant mountain of garbage. And so he's like, how do you even begin to like clean that up, right? It's very, very expensive. Often the tribes want to do it in a really ecologically responsible way, which, spoiler alert, is really expensive, right? Their perspective is, we're not just going to dump this on somebody else's territory. Indigenous people have ties, claims, and relationships to all of this, right? So we're not just going to like pawn it off. This is your problem now, right? And so the tribe's estimate for how much it's going to cost to responsibly remove a lot of this debris and pollution, right, might be way, way more, right, than what Humboldt County wants to pay if they're looking at the cheapest possible option. Some grow sites will have like 100 refrigerators or like 1,000 bicycles, like just like a crazy amount of stuff that gets left behind. A lot of petroleum products get left behind at grow sites. Propane, gasoline, diesel, and eventually, right, these plastics are going to degrade, right? Like not tomorrow, not next year, like eventually, right? These plastics are going to start to degrade and whatever is inside them, right, is going to be exposed to soils, right, and water. We see a lot of like equipment like this, right, get left behind, like batteries, right, other type of equipment, like the RVs, kind of trailer truck beds, vehicles, right, forerunners, like all of that sort of stuff often gets left behind. And then I have another story to tell, and this one's really gross, so just heads up. As I mentioned, right, a lot of the trespass grow sites are transient. They're not going to live there forever, right? After their harvest, they're out of there. And so often that means people don't take the time to invest in plumbing, or that type of infrastructure, build the trees. Some of you know where the story is going. In 2014, the tribe giving a ton of complaints that tribal members were getting sick with E. coli. And the environmental program went to all the RV spots, checked it out. You know, you do like your first kind of wave of like, all right, what are like the theoretically possible things it could be? But everybody who was getting sick was upriver of all of that. And there was nothing upriver of those people. Right. And so we figured out it was trespass cultivators that were openly defecating in tributaries of our river systems and were making tribal members sick. Right. Like people were getting E. coli from this. And one of the grossest cleanup stories I think came up during my research is one grow site had about 100 5-gallon buckets that were filled and capped with human sewage. Right. And after the gold rush, and after the timber rush, and after the fish rush, and now the green rush, like, why is it up to the tribes to deal with literally settler shit? Right. Like, this should not fall on us to clean up. Right. One statistic I like to share with folks is a 2008 Sierra Fund report estimated that in there were about 50,000 mines that are abandoned from the gold rush that are still in California that still haven't been cleaned up. About 87% of those mines have human health or environmental health impacts. And so the question I ask, right, is if we haven't been able to figure out how to clean up after our actions in the gold rush, like, what makes us think we are equipped, right, to handle the consequences of the green rush, right? And that's what the rush mentality says. Like, don't think, just do, just go quick, right? And so we've got kind of transitioned from one rush into another, right? And we haven't kind of stopped to think of like, have we even fixed all of the problems that we started in the first one, let alone, right, what we're doing to the landscape now. So in conclusion, I want to kind of pose a couple responses to the question of, well, what does this mean for decolonizing sustainability, right? Like, where do we go from here? And how do we begin to unpack, right, really the centrality of settler colonialism in historic American environmental movements and discourses? And so first thing I want to say is to highlight a lot of the important critiques that have been made for a long time by critical Indigenous studies scholars, Native American studies scholars around this idea of sustainability, right? Asking, what are we sustaining and for whom? Right? Deborah McGregor is an amazing Anishinaabe scholar, and she writes that sustainable development is just so that people can keep doing capitalism. And if that's the goal, that's that, right? We need better goals. And so asking, right, what is it that we are trying to sustain? Are we trying to continue to sustain an economy that relies on natural resource extraction? Because that sounds lame. And I think we could like dream up something much better. The second thing I want to talk about is if we're talking about sustainability, we need to reckon with the fact that settler colonialism as a structure is unsustainable, right? And until we reckon with that, right, we're not going to get very far, right, in this conversation of sustainability. It's like if somebody has like a major like internal injury, right, and we're like looking at the kind of symptoms that are happening, right, to their extremities or something, we're ignoring like the actual crux of the issue. Third thing I want to say is we need to resist the new wave of resource rushing that's happening right now, the rushing of Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional ecological knowledge, right? It's really, really cool that people are now interested in what Indigenous peoples have to say, and that we're talking about the fact that Indigenous peoples have always been here, that we're still here, right? But I see this kind of urge, this, I just learned about TEK, I'm going to use it, we're going to do it, it's going to be great. We don't need to talk to like real living Native peoples, right? This urge to kind of adopt, right, the principles of Indigenous philosophies, knowledge systems, and sciences without the actual inclusion of Indigenous peoples, right? They took our land, they took our trees, took all these stuff, right? And now they want to take our knowledge systems. No, thank you, right? And so ensuring that Indigenous peoples retain, right, ownership, control, right, over their philosophies, their knowledge systems. It is not something to be used and marketed by a settler colonial institution like an academic university, right? But should stay within the hands of Indigenous peoples, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't be listening to Native folks and the brilliant knowledge systems they've developed about their places, right? What I'm saying is that should center Indigenous peoples, and the way to do that is returning stolen lands and letting them do it themselves. Right? Studies actually show that one of the most efficient ways to restore forest ecosystems is the return of title to Indigenous peoples. There have been studies across Central America, Africa, as well as parts of Asia that have documented reforestation with the return of land titles to Indigenous communities. Additionally, there's a statistic by the World Bank from a 2008 report that Indigenous peoples are about 5% of the global population, but are responsible for protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so what I tell folks is if you're interested in the environment, that necessarily means you should be interested and invested in Indigenous peoples as well, right? I will also share that Cal Poly Humboldt was donated 800 acre forest to a couple years ago. We refer to it as Gukdeen. Settlers call it the Jacoby Creek Forest. And my question is, why was the university gifted 800 acres of Wiyot land? And why don't we give that back? Right? So that's one like really important thing that we can do. Dr. Kaitlin Reed and Carrie Tully, who is a graduate of the Environment and Community Program here at Cal Poly Humboldt, wrote a really excellent report on this, kind of highlighting ways in which we can make that happen. And so if you want to do something really cool before you graduate, wouldn't it be awesome if we could give Gukdeen back to Wiyot peoples, right? And I think that would make a really important kind of statement that Cal Poly Humboldt is in it for the long run of working with Indigenous peoples. And we're not trying to kind of become the new owners of traditional ecological knowledge, but want to support and facilitate, right, the return of Indigenous stewardship to these territories. Because the way we're going to get out of resource rushing, right, is not through the exploitation of Indigenous knowledge systems or kind of looking to the next new industry, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? We have documented systems, right, that work and facilitate kind of ecological and social balance within our regions. So I've talked for a while. I'll end there. Thank you very much, Waklao. We have time for questions.